Yes, thank you, Rashanika, and thank you everyone for joining. Can everyone hear me, or just Rashanika, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I just essentially just wanted to have a little bit of an introduction. Where does this Good Practice Handbook falls in? Essentially, the World Bank Group has financed hydropower throughout the history, and we will continue to do so because we do believe that hydropower is an important source of renewable energy in many of the countries we work in, and it will continue to form an important part of the energy matrix. And some countries only have the possibility of hydropower to produce domestic renewable power. So since we are in this space, we want to make sure that we continue to improve our practice and share good industry practices globally. Because while at the same time we understand that renewable energy, and hydropower, it's an important and will continue to be there. We also recognize that hydropower does have and can have significant impacts on environment and people and ecosystem services that the environment provides to people. So we are in the process as a World Bank Group to develop a series of tools to make up a sustainable hydropower toolkit, and this Good Practice Handbook is one of those tools. So we are in the process of developing a benchmarking instrument. There was a guidance note that just came out also earlier this month, and we will continue to add to this toolkit to make sure that not only our own projects, but projects out there can benefit from what we consider is good industry practice. So with this, we are lucky enough to have partnered with Southern Waters and with Dr. Kate Brown and her team to help us document what we consider is the good practice and an overall logical framework to approach e-flows when doing hydropower development. This is just the first, as I said, of a series of tools that we will be developing in the next 2 or 3 years. So with this, Kate, it's my pleasure to introduce you to this WebEx, and please go ahead with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me there? Hello, Monica?
Hi, Kate. We can hear you.
All right.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Pablo. As Rashanika explained, we are working with a remote presentation, so if you forgive me saying next every now and again, and if I sound a little nervous, it's because I am. So the Good Practice Handbook is an extension of the work that the World Bank Group has been doing on environmental flows over the last 25 years. The World Bank has a strong and rich heritage in taking the environmental flow assessment framework forward, and this Good Practice Handbook is a logical extension of that. It is born out of the realization that there was a lack of consistency in the way that environmental flows were being applied in World Bank and in other projects of a similar nature, but vastly different levels of application for environmental flow assessments. Next, please. The aims of the handbook are then to promote a consistent approach to e-flow assessments in World Bank Group-funded hydropower projects, as well, hopefully, in other projects that take the lead from the World Bank Group, to guide in the selection of an appropriate level of effort or resolution for e-flow assessments, and we'll get to this a bit later with the decision tree, to guide standardization on the quality and content and effectiveness of those assessments, and to indicate how to align environmental flows work in with other existing impact tools. Next, please.
Kate, can you, is there anything you can do, because everyone is saying that it's really choppy, the sound, and I can hardly hear you as well. Can you come closer to the microphone, or because it's really difficult to figure out what you're saying. Sorry to interrupt.
All right, let me just see what I can do. I'm sorry, the South African signal seems to have taken the dive today. Is that better?
No, it's really not better. Sorry everyone that it's connected, but I'm assuming everyone is having. Can you speak again, Kate, to see if it has improved?
Hello, this is Kate.
Kate, that's much better. Thank you.
That's much better, yes.
All right. Okay, my apologies for that, everybody. Shall I just carry on?
Yes, please.
All right. So I've been through the aims of the handbook. What the handbook does not do is provide instructions on how to do an environmental flow assessment, select stakeholders, negotiate and make decisions on environmental flow allocations, or implement environmental flows. I'm sure there'll be a time and a place when those do come, but that is not the focus of this handbook. Next, please. So at the outset, it's worth just considering what are environmental flows. The definition that is up on the screen now is from the Environmental Flow Conference in Brisbane in 2007, and it defines environmental flows as the quantity, timing, quality, and flow of water, sediment, and biota necessary to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems and the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on those ecosystems. Next, please. So, the focus of environmental flows then is on the quantity and quality of river flows, and that including sediment and including the movement of animals and plants. Most often this pertains to fish, but there are other animals that need to move up and down the length of the river, such as prawns and various other animals, as well as moving from the river itself onto floodplains, depending on where we find ourselves in the world. And it's the pattern of those flows that is important, and I'll touch on why in a second. Next, please. And the reason for concerning ourselves with that is first and foremost around sustainability and biodiversity, but that's by no means the only reason. The environmental flow speaks to things like reliable water supply, keeping viable businesses such as sediment mining, fishing, livelihoods, resilience, particularly in the face of climate change, and to issues such as equity. So essentially, next please, it is about protecting the systems that support us in the world. And that is the general ethos that underlies the entire handbook. Next, please. And because environmental flows tackles the functionality of river ecosystems in terms of how they interact with the flow of water and sediments through them, there's hardly, when it comes to hydropower development, there is hardly a World Bank safeguard or indeed any other kind of safeguard focused on aquatic ecosystems that does not intersect at some level with an environmental flow assessment. The most obvious of those are the things, as I've stated, that pertain to sustainability, to biodiversity protection, and to protection of indigenous livelihoods. But if you look in the handbook at the table that is similar to this one here, you will see that there's information that can be gained to the benefit of everybody from an environmental flow assessment pertaining to each and every one of those safeguards that are listed there. Next, please. And the reason for that is that the river ecosystems, environmental flows, and people are intricately linked with the pattern of flows through those rivers over the seasons and over the years. So that if what we've got on our screen now is a stylistic depiction of a seasonal variation in, for example, water flows, so that you would end up with your drier months and your wetter months with some seasons, transitional seasons between those. Next, please. So while that pattern is the overriding pattern, each and every part of that flow regime, there is a reaction to changes in any one of those parts. And that is because of the life history and habitat features that are linked to different parts of the flow regime, of the sediment regime, such as the onset and duration of seasons, which are linked to things like climatic factors, change in the ambient temperature. They're linked to things like cues for fruiting and flowering, cues for migration and breeding, all of which support life history patterns that have evolved over time in concert with the flows, the ebb and flows in the river. And any river ecosystem is existing in a state of sort of dynamic equilibrium in concert with the seasonal and annual fluctuations in its flow regime. Floods dictating channel form, and then dry periods when there's support for larval stages and that maintain interannual variability. Next, please. These, of course, are not only supporting the things that are living in the river, but there is nothing that is linked to the river that is not linked to this ebb and flow of water and sediments through the system, be that people that are fishing, be that people that are hiking, be that people that are using flood irrigation. So all aspects are linked to that. It follows then, next please. It follows then, if we take an example of an annual hydrograph, and that is what is on the screen in front of you. It's a hypothetical example that I've taken from a project, but stylized slightly, of showing a change in the hydrograph moving from a dry season through the transitional season between the dry and wet season into the wet season, when you would expect much more water in the system, greater floods coming through, and then gradually moving through that out from the wet into the dry through transition 2. So then that would be a typical river ecosystem that one might find oneself alongside. If you then take a hydropower project and put it in that river system, and next please, release a minimum flow release. So first of all, let's just look at the depiction of what it looks like in the dewatered reach, where the water's being taken out of the river and sent through the turbines. So what we've got here now on the dotted line is a minimum flow release being made from whatever the hypothetical hydropower station is that we have, and some of the wet season flows being stored, which is why there's much lower in the wet season, and that minimum flow release may be something like 20% of the dry season flows. But if we take a closer look at some of those components that I mentioned as being important in terms of guiding life history strategies in the river, we will see, next please, that in releasing a minimum flow and storing some of those dry seasons, if we divide that dotted flow regime up a little bit further, we see, first of all, next please, that the dry season, the onset and the duration of the seasons has changed markedly from what it was. The dry season is considerably longer. Typically, it's a time when river systems are under stress, from a range of things, not the least of which is ambient temperature. Depending where you are in the world, it could be very hot over this time, or it could be very cold with aspects such as fragile ice as a result. I'm getting some records of people not hearing me. Can you hear me?
Hi, Kate.
Yes, we can hear you fine, Kate.
All right. Thank you. So by making that minimum flow release, we have changed a whole lot of aspects of the flow regime. The transition seasons are happening at different times. The stressful time has been extended to double its length, and we've lost variability. The floods have reduced. So there's a whole lot of things that have changed, even though we've put in a minimum flow release to supply the river ecosystem. It is naive to expect that a river ecosystem that has evolved to react to all components of a flow regime will not change with just a minimum flow release in place. So the idea that we can put in a hydropower plant and release a standard minimum flow and have no change is one that does not hold water at all. If we then also, this has been for the dewatered reach. I've got a slight depiction here just for the downstream of the tail race. Next, please. Because downstream of the tail race, something slightly different happens depending on the operation of a hydropower plant. And it can be, and often is, something called peak power production, which in effect, in terms of the river, means a release of a flood every morning at peak times in order to generate electricity. So once again, if you are putting in a minimum flow release into a river, but you are also operating that system as a peak power production, it doesn't make sense to think that there wouldn't be any changes in the downstream river. And what the handbook is saying is that it's important for us to investigate those changes and to understand why it is that they're happening, particularly if we do want to track what the impacts are of hydropower on a system and how to mitigate those so that we can enhance sustainability. Next, please. So in terms of e-flows and hydropower, the handbook recognizes impacts of three main kinds. The dewatering of the reach, which we went through a second now, when water is taken out of the weir and passed through the turbines. Changes in the pattern of flow of water and sediment in that dewatered reach, but also downstream of the powerhouse or the tail race. And this is controlled by two main aspects: the amount of storage that is in the hydropower facility and the power production, whether it's base load or whether it's peak power production. And then the third aspect that hydropower can affect in terms of river functioning is connectivity. And there's two kinds of connectivity that can be affected. The first is probably the best known of those. It's the barrier effect of the dam wall and or the reservoir to things like the migration of fish or prawns or seeds or whatever. So it's that longitudinal connectivity. But an aspect of connectivity that gets slightly less consideration is that of lateral connectivity, where the hydropower is storing the floods, so the floods are much lower than they would normally be, which means the flooding of floodplains, which are used for breeding, is much less than they would have been. And so you have a loss of lateral connectivity as well. So those then are the three main aspects that the handbook addresses in terms of environmental flows and hydropower. Next, please. And the factors that are influencing the potential impact of those are location, design, and operation. Very simple. The three main factors that are influencing that. So next, please. So it stands to reason that in terms of location, where you put your dams in a basin is of paramount importance. If you can keep them out of areas where you've got main sediment supply or out of major migration routes, you'll either avoid or seriously reduce the impacts of the hydropower. Next, please. In terms of design, there's some very basic aspects of design that will majorly affect the level of impact of a hydropower plant on a river. A standard run-of-river project where there's flowing water upstream of a weir and downstream of a weir, where the weir is low and easy to overcome, will have minimal impacts on the flow of water, the flow of sediments, and the flow of biota. Whereas obviously something with a much bigger dam wall or a much bigger reservoir, at times hundreds of kilometers long, will trap almost all sediment going through, can store large portions of the flow regime and completely change the pattern. And then the other aspect of design is related to the how long is the diverted reach. Once you've taken water out of the river to go through the turbines, how long is that? In some cases, it can be several hundred meters. In other cases, it can be several hundred kilometers. In some cases, the water is sent to a completely different basin. Of course, the impacts on the riverine ecosystems that are being affected will be markedly different depending which of those is the chosen solution, is the chosen design. And in many cases, these chosen designs are being made in the absence of environmental flows. What the handbook is saying is that they should not be. In terms of operation, I've touched on this whole idea of power generation, whether you've got a base load power generation or peaking power generation. The small diagram that's come up there in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen shows a river in Namibia, the Kunene River. The solid line at the bottom is the normal dry season flow in that river, and the red lines are the operation of peaking power each weekday and twice a day to generate in the morning and the evening peak power, switching off in the weekends. Clearly, this is going to have a major impact on the downstream ecosystem. And then the next aspect of that, next please, is sediment. So we keep on making this point that environmental flows is the flow of water and the flow of sediment. These two, in terms of river ecosystems and river habitats, are intricately linked with one another. So how you're dealing with your sediment in the hydropower from an operational perspective, whether it's being flushed, what time of year it's being flushed, will have major implications for the potential impact on your downstream river. Next, please. Which brings us to the term run-of-river hydropower. And we have found over many years and much experience with the term, that the term run-of-river hydropower is of limited value from an environmental flows perspective and of extremely limited value for judging the impact on a river ecosystem. Next, please. And the reason for this is that it has been used to describe such a wide array of designs, from what we would call true run-of-river with small hydropower with no storage, right through to hydropower with huge storage where most of the flow of the river is diverted into a completely different river ecosystem. And because it's been used so loosely over such a wide area, type of designs, it is fundamentally not of value from an environmental flows perspective at the moment. So next, please. In the handbook, we've referred to either true run-of-river or low-impact design. And we've defined that as hydropower plants that release downstream into the same river with a short or no diversion, have less than 48 hours dry season storage, and do not make peaking power releases. hydropower plants that are like that will have relatively little impact on their riverine ecosystems and indeed any of the other aquatic ecosystems that they might affect. They are, however, few and far between, even though there are many run-of-river, so-called run-of-river hydropower projects around. So that the term from an engineering perspective and the term from an environmental flows perspective do not match. Next, please. Given that hydropower projects should seek to minimize impacts while optimizing energy generation, it speaks to the place that environmental flows should hold in deciding these things, because the hydropower plants are being placed right in the center of the rivers, affecting these flows that are going past. So, and we're just going to move through this, Monica. If you can give me the next, please. I've already spoken slightly about, I've already spoken to the idea of avoiding through location, design, operation, all of which require some of the information that comes from environmental flows. Go. They can be minimized, the effects can be minimized through environmental flow releases and the provision of fish passage. Ecosystems that need to be restored, such as reintroducing habitat, species, or social dependencies, all need to be based on an understanding of how the functionality of that system is going to change if you adjust the flow of sediments, water, and biota. So too is the idea of offsets, not necessarily offsets that protect equally important rivers elsewhere in perpetuity, but certainly those offsets, next please, that address things like management interventions to reduce existing impacts, for instance, on a river ecosystem. All of these aspects require a fairly in-depth understanding of the functionality of the river ecosystem that is being impacted. Next, please. And there is, because rivers operate at a basin level, the sediments in the water are flowing from the headwaters through the mountain streams, through the foothills, into the lowland rivers, onto the plains, and out through the estuaries. They operate as whole entities within their watershed, within their drainage basin. So there's little or no doubt that the possibilities for environmentally and socially optimal solutions increase the wider the scale that you're looking at with environmental flows. So that at the level of the basin, could you please go back? So that at the level of the basin, assessments such as SEAs and CIAs are the best place to be doing your in-depth environmental flow assessment. But to steal from the Chinese proverb that says the best time to have planted a tree was 25 years ago, and the second best time to have planted a tree is today, what we have said in the handbook is that there is no right or wrong time or scale to do an environmental flow assessment or to make provision for environmental flows. I myself have been involved in environmental flows for 25 years, and there has never been a time when we've gone in, regardless of the state of the project, how long it's been in operation, that the information from an environmental flow, if it hadn't been taken account of before, didn't add some value to how to operate the system to reduce the impacts. Not necessarily to alleviate them or avoid them, but to reduce them. Next, please. So it's long been the understanding of the World Bank Group that basin planning offers more options for sustainability for a whole host of reasons. It's easier to find offsets, there's less controversy, there is more, it's good PR to be planning early and to be understanding the systems that you're going to impact. Unfortunately, it doesn't often happen, but if and when it does, and there are examples of it happening in parts of the world. There's examples from Nepal, there's examples from the Okavango Delta, and various other places around the globe. And the environmental flow assessments are required to guide the detailed resource planning, such as location, operation, and so on and so forth. and they are being done in places in the world. Can we move forward, please? But in the absence of basin-wide studies, by far the bulk of the environmental flow assessments are being done for specific hydropower plants, and if they are being done so, they should be done in parallel with or under the umbrella of the ESHA or the ESIA. In the handbook, there's some guidance as to the sequencing of this and where and how the two sequences, those of the ESIA and those of the environmental flow assessment, might interlink. What I would like to do is just really highlight two places right now. Next, please. The first is the selection of the method and the scope. And that is really what the handbook is speaking to, and that fits very neatly into scoping. And we'll talk about that in a second with the decision tree. The second part is around the ESIA disclosure. And in terms of hydropower, if you have not gone through an environmental flow assessment and that has given some indication of how the flow impacts will be reduced, then the ESIA disclosure is incomplete. So it's important that if you're integrating the two, you include environmental flows into the request for proposals, and you make sure that the scheduling is such that the environmental flow assessment and the stakeholder consultations associated with that are completed before disclosure. Next, please. Oh, we reached the break.
Okay, thank you very much. We have, Kate, we have been getting a few questions, not many. Doug Smith has asked a question which I think is quite relevant, and many of us feel that way, which is that this conceptually is very good, and I think there is no disagreement, but how do we deal when there is very limited data and understanding of what's the relationship between flows and sediments and modifications of flow in ecosystem services and aquatic habitats? Essentially, how do we deal with the uncertainties when there is no data? And people, please ask questions in writing so I can post them to Kate as she responds.
Okay, thank you for that question. The lack of data, the paucity of data is common to all areas of the world, even those areas that have a fair amount of information on how the ecosystems are functioning. But certainly you're quite correct. In some of the areas where hydropower are being developed, there is very little data on the river ecosystems. However, several of the methods that are available for assessing environmental flows do not rely on empirical data collected in order to populate the relationships that they're using. What they rely on is an understanding of what is there, scientific studies that have gone before that describe the life history of the species that are in that river ecosystem, and then the basic principles of physics and aquatic ecosystem functioning that are extremely well established in the scientific literature to guide the assessments. And these assessments like this have been through all kinds of reviews. There's examples of them from many parts of the world by several environmental flow practitioners, where it becomes very clear that the relationships that are being drawn up are sensible, that they represent the ecosystem in charge that you are focusing on, and they can be used on which to make decisions, just in the same way as some of the economic information that's being used and some of the engineering information that's being used. So there's never a case of you can't do anything because you don't have data. I personally do not believe that a lack of data means that you need to go for a reduced resolution of environmental flow. I think a lack of data means you need to go for a more detailed environmental flow assessment where you can and do have a chance to understand the study river.
Thank you, Kate. Another question that has come in is also how do you think, or how much do you recommend that we rely, or practitioners rely on nationally defined regulations for minimum flows or E-flows when they exist?
I'm sorry, you said the last bit, rely on?
On local regulations and E-flows and standards that may be nationally defined.
I think that you will find, if you're relying on nationally defined standards, that you are limiting the potential of environmental flow information to help find a sustainable solution considerably. I will, in a minute or two, when we start to talk about different resolution methods, touch on that a little bit more. So perhaps we can come back to this question at the end of the session if I haven't answered it during the next part of the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. I think that's it for now. Let's continue, and then we can leave the rest of the questions till the end. Thanks. So please continue.
Okay. Thank you very much. So having set that scene, what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about the assessment methods that are available and how the handbook has handled these, because it is not the aim of the handbook to be prescriptive in terms of what methods you should use, but rather to guide you in terms of what level of effort you need to expend on environmental flow assessment. But the assessments themselves have been developing for a lot more than 30 years, and there's an astonishing array of those. In fact, at last count, there was something like 350 methods for assessing environmental flows. The important thing about this, however, is that the vast majority of those have been used once or have only been used in academics. So there's a much smaller number of assessments that have been used quite regularly. Which brings it down to a much more handleable number. But the kind of assessment methods that are available range from very simple hydrological or hydraulic indices, 10% of the flow, or bank full discharge, or whatever, right through to much more detailed holistic assessments. And what I've done here is I've drawn the distinction between prescriptive methods and interactive methods. Next, please. And the reason that I've done that is, depending on what you are doing and what the nature of your study, it's very important to understand not only what resolution your environmental flow assessment is, and the other, it's not only important to understand that, but it's also important to understand how it's going to provide the information. So this distinction between prescriptive and interactive is useful because prescriptive methods will recommend a flow. And that flow might be, for instance, 20% of the dry season discharge. But it will not provide you with any information on what will happen if you don't meet the flow requirements. What will happen if I only get 15%, or what will happen if I get 25%? It won't provide, those methods will not provide you with any information of what if. So they are very difficult to use to inform trade-offs, whereas the interactive methods have two benefits over prescriptive methods. The one is that they provide the implications of different flows. In other words, they provide information to allow trade-offs. And the other thing is that they focus on the relationships, which makes them a lot more transparent in terms of your river. Okay, so I'm just highlighting that as we move forward because it's important to get that to any environmental flow study. That not that one is better than the other, there's a place for each of them, but it's important to know going into it which one you are being faced with the method that has been chosen for you or that you have chosen to do an environmental flow assessment. Next, please. But what the handbook does is that it distinguishes between low, medium, and high level of effort, low, medium, and high resolution of information environmental flow information for a particular basin or for a particular individual project. Next, please. And so your low resolution methods would be not a great deal of effort. They're usually desktop, things like the tenant method, the wetted perimeter method. They're based on data extrapolated from areas where more detailed studies have been undertaken. So, for example, the tenant method coming from the mountains of Montana. So one needs to question where you are implementing it, because that's where the information has come from. And you need to presumably do that in a similar area. They are typically hydrological hydraulic indices. They are typically prescriptive. There's no consideration of sediment flows, no detail on the responses of habitats or species, which is not to say they do not have a place. They are extremely useful parts of scoping exercises and to encourage basin-wide thinking and guide the selection of strategic priorities. My belief is that in terms of analyzing impacts of hydropower projects, they're of limited use, and I've explained that a little bit earlier when we were going through how a minimum flow might change an entire flow regime with unexpected consequences. Next, please. So methods that operate at the medium and high resolution are that most of the methods can operate at both medium and high because they're extremely similar to one another. They collect and use data from the study river. They focus on relationships between flow and river life. And because they do that, they can address the climate change impacts. How you might expect the river to change if the rainfall and the pattern of flows changes in the catchment. They distinguish, medium and high distinguish from each other by the spatial scope of the study, the number of components that one is looking at, whether it's water quality, plants, fish, birds, crocodiles, trees, whatever you think to add to that, and the level of effort involved in collecting and analyzing local information. Importantly, the ones that we've identified as medium or high resolution are usually incorporate survival of individual species. So you can talk to things like critically endangered species and how they might be expected to do with the hydropower in place or with the provisions that are being put in place for environmental flows. They talk to things like the migration of fish and barriers to that migration, the impacts of sediment reduction, the effects of peaking power releases, and other things such as management interventions and other things. There are a number of medium and or high resolution methods that are being used in the world with great success in data poor environments. Please move forward. What we've done in the handbook is to list some of the most commonly used. If you have a look in the handbook, you will see that there's direction to where you can go and get more information on this. There's some indication of whether it is, what level of resolution it can normally be applied at, what kind of categorization it is it hydrological, habitat simulation, holistic, how does it fit into that, and who are the people that are being applied and where there's examples of that application. So what we've tried to do without being prescriptive on what methods you should use, we've tried to give an indication of those that have been most commonly applied and most importantly, those that have some kind of a user guide and assistance for people to pick them up and apply them. Next, please. So really the big question then is which resolution is the most relevant for a particular project or a particular basin. And the general principle that's applied is as potential impacts increase in magnitude and complexity, you need a greater understanding of the implications and options, and you need a greater level of detail for the assessments. Going back to what we were saying earlier, if potential impacts include things like changes to a whole different lot of aspects of the flow regime or the sediment regime, if they include barriers to the movement of biota, it simply does not make sense to set a minimum flow without proper investigation because you're just kidding yourself. There's no ways that a minimum flow will take care of the river. if there's a whole lot of other changes that are being made as a result of the hydropower plant that is being put in place. Next, please. Obviously, there's other issues also affecting resolution. Existing impacts, the position in a cascade. If you're first in a cascade, you are likely to be the one that has the biggest impact. Or if you're most downstream. Political boundaries. Many of the hydropower schemes that are being proposed are on the borders of countries, with the impacts occurring downstream and the benefits occurring upstream. The type of ecosystem affected. While there tends to be quite a few low-resolution methods for rivers, there are far fewer for things like estuaries, wetlands, lakes, floodplains. They simply don't exist. And of course, the degree of social dependency. If there's a lot of people involved, the situation probably needs a greater level of resolution. Next, please. So what we've done is that we've distilled a number of selection criteria. And those are storage volume, which speaks to the ability to control flows of water and sediment. The kind of operation, peaking versus baseload operation, which speaks to daily fluctuations in flows. Whether there's a transboundary or basin or transbasin diversion, so you're affecting a much greater area or perhaps a different country. If there's ecosystems other than rivers, such as estuaries, wetlands, and so on and so forth, I've just explained that there are not rapid methods for them. The social dependence on the river for fish passage, for sediment mining, anything else, that if there's a great level of social dependence so that you would affect people's livelihoods by changing the flow of water and sediment. Whether you're first or most downstream in a cascade, whether you're in high, natural, or critical habitats in terms of IFC and World Bank definitions, or whether you're in modified habitat. And what we've done is we've taken those, next please, and put them into a decision tree. And quite simply, this decision tree moves through those criteria and directs you in one way or the other from a medium resolution assessment, whether you will be going into a low or into a high resolution assessment. Next, please. So you start by defining the storage capacity and whether or not your hydropower has design that includes a river diversion. Next, please. Hit it twice. Peaking power versus base load, with peaking power generation requiring environmental flow methods that can analyze the impact on river ecosystems of hourly changes in flows. Many of the course level environmental flow assessment methods work on monthly data. They don't even consider changes in daily flows. But if you're doing peaking power generation, you need to be working with hourly or minute flows. Next, please. Transboundary issues we've spoken about. Next, please. And transbasin. Are there two rivers affected? Is one river being completely dewatered and another river being completely overwatered? Next one, please. And are there other affected ecosystems that I've spoken to now in terms of not having those relationships on which rapid assessment or low resolution assessments rely? Next, please. Are there people dependent on the river? In each case, the answer no leaves you in a medium resolution assessment. The answer yes will move you into a high resolution assessment. Whether you have social dependence, next please, whether you are most or foremost downstream in a cascade, and therefore are the hydropower that can be expected to drive any of the impacts that are happening, and then whether you're in critical habitat or modified habitat defined in terms of World Bank policy. The one raises the risk profile of the project and the other one reduces the risk profile of the project. So the modified habitat is the one that will push you across into low resolution. If the river ecosystem is already monumentally changed from what it would have been under natural circumstances, there remains very little reason to spend a great deal of time and effort looking at environmental flows. So next, please. And then there's the idea of that regardless of what level you're doing, you still need to have a look at sediments, because sediments trapped by a hydropower dam can significantly, and indeed have in many parts of the world, significantly altered downstream channel morphology and habitats and increased bank erosion. Next, please. And a connectivity assessment in terms of the movement of biota and other material along the river and how this might be affected by the hydropower. There's very little point in putting in compensation flows or environmental flows for a fish species that needs to get upstream of the dam to breed but cannot. So you need to understand the broader issues of movement throughout the basin before you can sensibly suggest environmental flow mitigations. Next, please. So in general, the decision tree will recommend low-resolution methods for hydropower plants that do not affect natural and critical habitats. For those so-called true run-of-river projects that I was speaking about before the break, and for baseload plants that have no substantial influence on the flow of water or sediments. Medium resolution methods will be recommended in most cases, particularly for those that do not affect critical habitats, have low social dependence, and are near other existing hydropowers. In other words, they're part of a cascade, as long as they're not first or the most downstream one. And then high resolution holistic methods, those that consider the environment as a whole, that look to individual species, tell you what will happen with them and why, would be recommended for hydropower plants that affect critical habitats, ecosystems other than rivers, areas where there's so high social dependence, such as a major fishery, where there's transboundary, where the impacts on one country are going to affect a downstream country. It is likely that that downstream country is going to want quite a bit more information than just, trust me, 10% will be fine, and whether there's a trans-basin diversion. Next, please. So what I've done is I've got two examples here. I'm not sure how I'm going for time, and I'm sure somebody will put something on the chat telling me I can skip one if needs be. But the first one that I've got is just, I just want to take you through that decision tree for
you have
examples.
5 minutes or so, Kate.
Okay, thank you very much. This is for the Poonch River Mahasea National Park in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. It is critical habitat because it has, can you go next please? The endangered Kashmir catfish and the Mahasea. Next please. The river system, there are other hydropowers on the system in India, and downstream of this, the river flows into Mangala Dam. So it's a fairly limited section of river, but it is in the Poonch River Mahasea National Park. Next, please. If we follow down through the decision tree, it is a large dam, the Gulpur hydropower plant that's being planned there, a large dam. It was planning on doing peaking power, so there was a peaking power assessment. But there was no significant transboundary issues, trans-basin diversions. There were no ecosystems other than the river affected. There was no significant social dependence, although there was a fair amount of poaching on the river. And it was not first or most downstream in the cascade. As it turns out, it probably is going to be most downstream, but it wasn't going to be originally. But it is in critical habitat, as I've explained to you. There was a high resolution assessment done for this system. Next, please. What that comprised, and what I do is try and give you an idea of what that means when we say a high resolution assessment. This was done in 2014 and 15. It involved four reaches of river, one upstream, one between the dam wall and the tail race, so the dewatered section, and two in the downstream river, downstream of the tail race between that and Mangala Dam. The environmental flow scenarios incorporated considerations of changes in the pattern and volume of the downstream flows, of the sediment. It involved a connectivity assessment. It looked at options for turbine selection, options for management protection. It involved a team of 4 international consultants and a team of local specialists who knew the river ecosystem well. The cost was $350,000 US, including disbursements. And the environmental flows assessment influenced the planned turbine design, weir location, and the operational regime of the hydropower plant. It also introduce management measures to reduce poaching in the park and therefore achieve a biodiversity net gain, which was done in consultation with conservation management stakeholders and the local communities. So there was an awful lot of work that was done there, a lot of attention that was paid, but the overall costs were not exorbitant, and I'll come back to those in a second. Next, please. The other example I have is just one where it stayed as medium. It's on the Zambezi River in Batoka Gorge, immediately downstream of Victoria Falls, and some couple of 100 kilometers further on the river flows into Kariba Gorge. Next, please. So if you go down the decision tree, there was peaking power production was planned. It no longer is being planned. It was planned, but none of those triggers for significant transboundary issues or other ecosystems or social dependence or any of those triggers were responded to with a yes. So it ends up being a medium resolution assessment. Next, please. That involved 2 sites downstream of the tail race to Kariba Dam. It looked at changes in volume of the downstream flows and the downstream impacts of sediment trapping. It also very briefly looked at conductivity assessment, but because Victoria Falls is upstream of the hydropower dam, that's a major natural barrier, so blocking of the river ecosystem was not relevant. It was a team of 6 international consultants looking at various aspects of the river ecosystem, and the cost inclusive of disbursements was $110,000 US, all in. Next, please. What I've done here is, if you wouldn't mind just me taking a little bit of time to go through this. This is a quote from the CEO of Hydropower about that Punch assessment, the high resolution assessment. And it just gives his views as a developer of being forced, because they were not happy with being asked to do a high-level environmental flow assessment, being forced to do this, but this is after the fact. And he writes that the use of a holistic environmental flow modeling was instrumental in improving our ability to achieve net gain to the lenders as well as local authorities, and in making the project an example of creating a win-win situation for economic development. They could not have done that without this information coming from an environmental flow. The financial costs of the study and subsequent negotiations were negligible relative to other development costs. The cost of the protection measures were incorporated into the power purchase agreement, and the redesign of the diversion tunnel resulted in a considerable reduction in construction costs. It's not always the case, but sometimes, and quite often, taking a full account of all of the information that you can and the full knowledge of the systems that you are changing and that you are operating within can benefit not only the river ecosystem, but also the developers of that river ecosystem. Next, please. So I'm going to leave the resolution of the methods for a moment here and just talk about, for the couple of minutes that are remaining, some of the other features in the handbook. Also in there for your use is the data requirements for environmental flow assessments for each level, for hydropower projects, for issues such as socioeconomics, hydrology, hydraulics, and all the aspects that make up. There's lists of the data requirements. There's an idea of the relative costs of different kinds of environmental flow assessment, not just in US dollars, but also in terms of the number of specialists needed, the work trips, people days. By and large, because there are not a lot of data available on these things, most of the methods, in fact, all of the methods rely to some extent on expert opinion. There's a generic terms of reference for project and basin, low, medium, and high resolution environmental flow assessments that lays out the scope of work for engagement of stakeholders, selection of scenarios, and all of the technical information required. I believe that if I, as an environmental flow practitioner, were to be given a terms of reference such as one of those, I would then be in a very good position to motivate what method I would like to use and why as part of a bidding process. So I believe that those are potentially extremely useful in terms of not only, once you've decided what level of assessment to do, of guiding people coming to you with suggested methods to be used. There's an annotated table of contents for an environmental flows management plan and a log frame for inserting environmental flows into hydropower projects and planning. With what we know about them at the moment, these things being what they are, it will change over time, but that's what we know at the moment. And then there's a basic 10-point checklist for anybody who's reviewing an environmental flows assessment. What should you check for? How do you know if it's any good or not? Next, please. So that brings me to the last slide, I just want to go over the recommended approach as it is encompassed in the handbook. It is to understand the context of river functioning and provision of ecosystem values into which environmental flows will be introduced. To understand the potential downstream impacts associated with hydropower development and how these can be mitigated, and the fact that they can, particularly given a will. Understand the kinds of information provided by environmental flow assessments and how that will assist with the mitigation of some of those impacts. And it's certainly how it will assist with identifying those impacts and defining them. Apply a context-appropriate environmental flow assessment method. With the complex changes that are happening to our ecosystems, putting a single number in simply does not address the issue. Conduct a comprehensive and appropriate stakeholder engagement program and compile an environmental flows management plan on the basis thereof. Thank you very much for your patience. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kate. I'll try to group. We have got a lot of questions. Rashanika, how much time do we have? We have still half an hour or so, right?
Next slide, please.
We can extend by another 5 minutes or so.
Okay, so Kate, can you hear me?
I can. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yes, so we won't be able to cover all the questions, I don't think, but I'll just group them in two general buckets from what we have received so far. I'll go with the easier ones first, which is mostly related to whether the drift as a system is free. Or like other systems like FastBeam and some of the U.S. developed ones. And you covered this already, but you may want to refer to the handbook itself. How much can this cost, right? So I mean, there were a few questions on how much time and effort does an e-flow complying with the performance standards and good practice can cost. So those are, I guess, maybe take those questions first, and I'll go more with the more technical questions.
Okay, you might need to repeat the second one because my mind was wandering. I apologize. In terms of drift, no, it's not free. It's not expensive. That's all outlined on the drift website. No, you shouldn't open the website, Rashanika, but I gave you the address for that website in case anybody wants to go there. Everything is explained in quite a bit of detail. There's also, it's free for academic use, it's free for research, and there's a very good, what we call studio version that is free. I'm sorry, the next thing was to do with how environmental flow speaks to the
No, how much time and effort, and yeah, we have a table in the Good Practice Handbook, but I think you may want to refer to it, like how much time and effort and cost does it take to have an e-flow that would be complying with the performance standards?
Okay, so that is in the it is in the handbook, that idea of time and cost. There's a table there that gives the time and cost of different levels of resolution. In terms of the decision tree, my understanding is if we followed the decision tree and selected an appropriate level, and then that would adhere to the performance standards, and then you can go to that table that will give you an idea of the level of effort in terms of personnel and number of days and so on and so forth. I hope that answers the question, Pablo.
Yes, and now I'll go more to more detailed questions in terms of the technical part, Kate. And again, I'll go through all the ones that I can group. So please write them down so then you can try to answer them together. One is the questions of trade-offs. How can we, or if you have, can you share any practical experience on a good balance between profitability of a hydropower project vis-a-vis offsetting or having e-flows that would meet good international practices? So how do we do those trade-offs? Are there any technical advice that you can give, again, between the trade-offs of releasing sediments downstream and the impact associated with water quality, spawning grounds, etc., when you release sediments at once? And another question relates to whether there is a recommendation on good practice if e-flows should be an integral part of the environmental and social impact assessment or a standalone assessment, and if an environmental flow management plan should be a standalone plan or part of the ESMPs. What is the relationship between, how do you connect or relate an e-flow studies vis-a-vis a connectivity studies, a connectivity assessment, and what exactly is the difference between those two? And there was another question related directly to the decision tree of how do we define significance in the water segment. So I'll park on that. Those are 5 different questions, all related, to the core of the Good Practice Handbook. So I hope you got them all, right? Just trade-offs, ESIAs versus standalone, and significance of the water segment, and connectivity vis-a-vis e-flows.
Okay, I wrote those down. Let's hope I do them in a reasonable order. In terms of trade-offs, the practical experience in terms of trade-offs to enhance with respect to hydropower plants on rivers, one of the key aspects that has come up time and time again in many of the areas that we're working with is the idea that these river ecosystems, many of the river ecosystems where hydropower are being planned, have not existed in a vacuum. So they have other impacts on them. And what the bank has used in several occasions is the idea of using some of the resources that are generated by the hydropower plant to reduce some of the other impacts. And examples of that, and I take them both from the Poonch only because it's at the top of my mind right now, are reducing poaching so that the endangered fish numbers are not suppressed through use of dynamite and other illegal fishing methods. So you have a much higher population that then is impacted by the hydropower dam, but you end up with something that was better than before. And the whole idea of sediment mining. In most parts of the world, sediment mining is a large and significant use of river ecosystems. But the other thing is that if you're going to dam those river ecosystems, your sediments will settle out at the head of the pond, which is going to create a whole lot of problems, which we'll get to just now, the trade-offs of releasing sediments. But it also means that you're depositing potentially sediments in a place where they're all in one place and they can be accessed. So I believe that there's a need for some of the innovative solutions that have been applied in piecemeal fashion around the world. Things like harvesting sediments from the top end of dams and using it as agricultural compost and so on and so forth. And there are these examples. We've started to gather them now as we start to move. So it's really about some of the subtleties, as well, of course, as ensuring that you release sufficient flows in the right pattern and so on and so forth. In terms of the trade-off of releasing sediments, the timing and the volume of that is incredibly important. And typically what we find is that, look, your silts and your sands, your silts and your clays come over the top. But in terms of sands and then cobbles, there's a long lead-in time before you can release anything. And when you do, of course, there's a danger that you'll smother the downstream environment. So the amount that you release and the timing and ensuring that you're releasing at a time when the sediments would normally have occurred, we find is the key thing to reducing the impact of sediments. And I, as yet, have not found a rule of thumb for you in this kind of rivers you must release sediments, in this kind of rivers you mustn't release sediments. I know that in some of the big sediment rivers, the loss of sediments is going to be a major, major, major impact, which speaks to the desirability of flushing sediments. And in this particular instance, I'm thinking about something like the Mekong, where by and large, the biggest impact of hydropower development on the main stem and indeed in the tributaries of the Mekong is related to this whole idea of sediment flushing. But there's definitely some way to go to understanding what those trade-offs are. Whether the environmental flow should be an integral part of the ESIA or a standalone, I think that the pragmatics come into it, but I do not believe that that you can do an ESIA for a hydropower development on a river without doing an environmental flow. If an ESIA is supposed to figure out what the impacts are going to be, then you cannot figure that out without doing some kind of an environmental flow assessment. The relationship between environmental flows and connectivity. Well, let's just step aside away from environmental flows for a second in terms of water and sediment and talk about connectivity per se. The way that we are dealing with connectivity is to run scenarios where we put, if we can, put fish passages in play and other things to help animals get through the reservoir, help fish get through the reservoir, and model the changes in terms of the success rate of getting species through. In some cases, upstream populations are not viable given the different impacts that are happening. Remember that any impact on a fish species is cumulative. So it will first have an impact in terms of you changing its flows. Depending on how serious that is, that might reduce the population. Then there will also be an impact because you're changing the sediment. That might reduce the population. And then if you're only getting a percentage of your fish through, so your breeding success is also hampered significantly, those sort of triple impacts on it might be sufficient to eliminate a particular species from a reach. So in some cases, we found that because of the level of impacts from a hydropower dam in terms of sediments and flows, even if you get 90% of your fish up and past the dam through the reservoir and then back down all the way, you still are not going to be able to save your species. And in other cases, if you get 50% through, it's fine. It's very dependent on the fish species. It's not dependent on the data you collect in the river. It is dependent on the understanding that you build up of that fish species by looking at its life history and where it breeds and how it breeds and where it needs to move to. I'm sorry, that's quite a complex area, and I find it quite difficult to deal with very quickly in a question now. Pablo, my last thing here says define significance, and I can't remember what that was.
Yeah, it was significance of the dewater segment. How do we define the water segment that has significance? Okay,
yeah, you'll notice when you go through the decision tree that there's some areas that really are context specific, and it became almost impossible for us to give much more guidance. It's really about if you are on a huge river and there's a small diversion, it's probably insignificant unless it's right where, your keystone species exist, your it's right in the middle of your critical habitat. It really is something that you'll need to assess for yourselves on a project-specific basis, basin-specific basis, in terms of not only the length of that, but where it's situated in terms of the overall flows in that system. So I apologize, I can't help much more than that.
No, I understood, and I think that's the same question that many of us face, even doing any type of significance. When an impact is significant, and specifically in a deep-water reach, will depend on the type of quality of that and habitat and the uses that are given in that habitat. We have many other comments and questions, but we're running out of time. I think that there was another, just a question regarding with connectivity, and the answer to that I'll give it, because it is yes, we tried, when we talked about connectivity, we talked about connectivity upstream and downstream, meaning fishing moving upstream and downstream, and e-flows is defined not only related to waters, but also the way that it's defined in the Good Practice Handbook is the flows, and that we call them environmental flows. It's flows of water and in terms of quantity, quality, etc., but also sediments and biota. So that's what is called e-flows and environmental flows. I will close this again thanking all the participants. We had over 100 participants, which is fantastic. We remain open to continue to have questions and respond. This is, as I said, part of our efforts to make sure that we continue to share good practices to achieve sustainable hydropower development, because we believe that hydropower will remain an important component or contributed to the energy matrix and to renewables into countries' energy matrices, and the IFC will continue to finance those, and the World Bank will continue to finance hydropower, but we do recognize that they are significant lessons learned and good practice to implement. So again, I want to thank you, Kate Brown and her team, for the great job that she did in this presentation, or they did it in the presentation as well, and in the handbook, and please, if you have any further questions, do contact us, and we'll try to canalize them to Kate Brown. Thank you very much, and I don't know, Kate, if you have any closing remarks, but we are running out of time.
I would just like to thank everybody for bearing with us through some of the technical difficulties, and it was a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.